start recording, share screen, and today, oopsie daisy. All right, sorry about that. Nothing fishy open. Just looking at places to go to where we're thinking of on-site events. So for you guys only. Alrighty, today's class is on promises, async, and await. This is a link to the slides. Let me paste it in chat. And let me give some context for today. Today's class is going to be difficult, or as we say in Hindi, आज घोड़े खुलेंगे सबके. Your horses are going to open, I guess this is in English also. But long story short, today's class is the most difficult class in the last 2 weeks, and also the most difficult class for the upcoming weeks as well. This is where a lot of people get confused. So it's not a very long class. I will try to wrap up the syllabus and everything here in 1.5 hours maybe, and then I'll be open to doubts because this requires a lot of practice. I did not know what promises are until I got into GSOC. My GSOC mentor from basically when I was in my third year, when I was doing Amazon and GSOC, my GSOC mentor, I remember halfway through my internship, taught me about promises because the code base that I was working on used promises. So I did not know about promises for a really long time. I was using callbacks, just like we learned yesterday. Promises were something new to me. I learned after a really long time. We are hoping you learn them early because we are going to use a lot of them in the upcoming weeks. So today's class is primarily going to be about promises and async await. Async await and using promises is the easy part. Defining your own async function, this slide number 8, is going to be the most difficult bit, which I would assume half of the people don't understand today, which is fine. In cohort 1, I strictly remember in the class where we were discussing this, I just discussed until here and I asked, do you guys understand this? Most people said no, and I said it's fine, we will discuss it eventually. So this slide, if you don't understand today, it's fine. Everything else, hopefully try to understand. As I said, 1.5 hour class, after which we will answer doubts and you can go from there. All right, bounty is a $50 bounty. Small anecdote, I might make a video on this also, and small comparison to the real world. Can you see how the level of bounties is going up? First week, bounty was for someone who was able to do the assignment. It was this easy to get a bounty. Second week, if you remember yesterday's class, everyone who did the assignment, I did not talk about. I repeat, week 2 की जो Web3 assignment थी, the Web3 assignment of week 2, I did not discuss that in class, but people who were able to do it got the bounty. And today, the person who has gotten a bounty is the person who already solved the assignment for today. Basically, went one day ahead of the class and solved it. Does that mean I should be discouraged as a beginner, Hakirat? No, this is just how the real world works. In 2020, it was very easy to get a job. Everyone and their mother was getting into, Google and Facebook and through DSA, and, people were negotiating offers left, right, and center. But what has been happening, slowly the level of engineers is increasing. And the bar keeps on going high. AI makes it even higher. Now anyone can code. And hence, these bounties are generally not fabricated, but, are meant for, this person differentiated themselves, so are jobs. So, keep that in mind and, don't get discouraged by this. The real world also requires this only eventually. You can win a bounty here and there, but what matters more is getting a real job. And for getting a real job, these are the things that matter a lot. A lot of people have been hired by a few companies already. But again, these were not beginners, but people who already knew some stuff, did some very pretty assignments. Someone was hiring for a UI UX designer, they got connected. So as a beginner, don't worry about any of this. But my point is, keep raising the bar and, keep going one step ahead as time goes by. All right. Today, we're doing classes in JavaScript. We need to understand this before we can move on to promises. Then we'll revise callbacks, the thing that we did yesterday. We'll understand about this thing called callback hell, which is one of the reasons that promises was introduced. Then we will understand about how can you use promises, the easy bit. Then we will understand how you can use promises in a async await syntax. And lastly, we will try to create our own promises, which will be the most difficult bit. People were asking about the assignments. So here is a link to the assignments. Don't worry about it right now. I will create a dedicated video where I will share how do you target assignments, how do you solve them, how do you test them, how do you make sure your tests are indeed passing. So you can look at it if you want, but if you're a complete beginner, maybe wait 2-3 days. I will release a video on how you can solve it, then try to solve it. All right, let's kick things off. Let's understand about classes in JavaScript. Some of you might already know this, some of you might not. If you know this, and feel free to take a break for the next 10 minutes. Classes in JavaScript are something extra we haven't discussed. We have discussed some primitive types, numbers, strings, booleans. We have discussed some complex types, if you remember, objects and arrays. Hopefully, writing these 5 things is easy for you by now. By now, you understand, okay, slides link. By now, hopefully you understand how you can write a very simple project. There you go, slides links. In JavaScript, a sum function, a palindrome function, things like these. These are also in the assignment. So you should try to write some more programs to get comfortable with these 5. Today, let's understand about classes. Classes are वैसे तो fairly common concept in programming languages. Java, if you've ever done, you might have heard about inheritance and classes. You might have used classes to, inherit from one class to another. I think even Riddhi covered this in the DSA classes. Similar concept exists in JavaScript. In JavaScript, classes are a way to define the blueprint for creating an object. Now, the object that we're talking about here is different from the object we have used over here. What was the object that we had used over here? A simple key value pair. If you remember, let me open Visual Studio Code and open a random project from yesterday. And here, let me write, oopsie daisy, that's too much. Const object equal to, or let's say user equal to name Harkirat, age 21. Let me also disable my AI over here. This is how we had created objects until now. This object is different from the object that we are talking about in the slides. In JavaScript, classes are a way to define blueprint for creating a different kind of object. This is how you define a class. Now I'm throwing a lot of syntax at you. So let's try to first read through some key concept of classes. Then we will understand what this syntax over here does. How do you define a class of your own? For example, here I am defining a rectangle class. How do you create an object from that class? Const rect equal to new rectangle. This rect variable is what we are calling an object. This rectangle is what we are calling a class. The key concepts of a class include, number 1, class declaration. The thing that I am doing over here, I am defining a class rectangle, inside which I am writing a bunch of things. We will get to what those things are. You declare a class using the class keyword. That is exactly what I did above. Inside a class, you define properties and methods that will belong to the objects created from this class. What did we say? We said, okay, they are a way to define the blueprint for creating an object. What does blueprint mean? It means that in the real world, let's say there is an animal. Then animal can either be, a mammal or a fish. I totally forgot the types. Maybe let's take a different example. In the real world, let's say there is a shape. Rectangle, square, circle. These shapes have some properties, right? For example, a rectangle has some width, has some height, might have some color. These are what makes it the blueprint of this class. Okay, whenever you are creating a rectangle, you have to give it a width, a height, and a color. These 3 are what make up a rectangle in the real world, right? Similarly, if this was a circle class, then the constructor, we will come to what the constructor is, but that would have probably taken the radius as the input. So What we're trying to do is define a class, declare a class, define the blueprint of what this class looks like. Every object of this class, whenever I am creating a rectangle object, I need to give it a width and a height. Also need to give it a color. This is incorrect. There should be a third argument here called blue or red, something like that. Let's try to understand what this constructor is, what this area function is, what this paint function is. When you declare a class, what did it say over here? You declare a class using the class keyword. Inside a class, you define properties. What are the properties of a rectangle? A rectangle has a width, a height, and a color. We attach the width, height, and color that the user gave us. I repeat, as I said, there should be a third argument here, something like red or a blue. Whenever you create an object, what is happening inside the constructor? What does the constructor mean? Someone has constructed an object. Whenever you write new rectangle, you construct a new object and the control reaches this constructor. You attach 2, 4, and red to the object. These 3 lines of code, try to memorize this syntax. Okay, these 3 lines of code, what they are doing is, if the user gave us 2 as the width, I am assigning the width of this object to be 2. If the user gave us 4 as the height, the second argument, I am assigning the height of this object to be 4. And then if the user gave us a color, I would assign the color of this object right here to be the color. That is the third argument. This is what happens when you instantiate, I repeat, instantiate the instance of a class. What am I doing here? I am creating an object called rect from the class rectangle. I am creating an object called rect from the class rectangle. I am giving it some properties. Here you want a width, you want a height, and then maybe a third property called color. And over here, what we're doing is we're attaching those properties to the object. Let's try to copy this code and run it locally. Now you don't have to run it just yet. We will be running it with you very soon. Let me just show you this in action. Okay, this is the class definition. This is the constructor. When you run this line of code, control reaches here. These 3 properties get set. And now on this object, I can call the area function. I can call the paint function. As you can see, this is just a cleaner way to write native things. What do I mean by native things? I mean I could totally do this also. Let's forget all of this. I could have done something like this. Const rect equal to width 2, height 3, and then color red. This also works, right? I could create a function called area that takes the rect as the input and then simply return, rect.width into rect.height. I can do this natively as well. I don't have to create a class, but classes give you some, number one, cleaner syntax. Isn't it cleaner to write rect.area than call the area function with the rect1 variable? So you can totally do whatever we are doing with a class. You can do natively also. What are we doing here? Defining an object, defining a function, calling the function. You can totally do this, but the syntax below, feel free to breathe this in for like maybe 10 seconds. I'm hoping this is straightforward. Okay, define a variable, define a function, call the function with the rectangle variable. If you want to see this in action, let me quickly comment everything below and run this code locally so you can see what this prints as well. You don't have to run it yet. We'll run it very soon. But if you see this code running, if I run node index.js, it prints 6 on the screen, because what would area of this rect1 be? It will be rect.width, which is 2, into rect.height, which is 3, which is 6, which is what we print over here. So this is one way to define, let's say a rectangle and then print it on screen. You might say, Harkirat, this though isn't a visual rectangle. I don't see any rectangle printed anywhere. Yes, this is a fairly dummy implementation of, a rectangle class. You can get fancy and, actually print this in the browser. Let's not go there yet. Just define a simple thing, print the area on screen. This is one way of doing it. What is the other way of doing it? Using the class-based syntax. Define a class inside which you have the area function, inside which you have, let's say, the paint function, which whoever is instantiating a rectangle object, they can call .area, and then you can log it over here. You can call rect.area rather than doing area of rect. It's just slightly cleaner syntax to look at compared to the native syntax that I wrote a while back. Again, this is an object. This is the class name. This line of code will make sure control reaches here, and the width gets attached to this object. What does getting attached mean? I basically mean if I log rect dot width over here, then it will be set to 2, and that happens inside this constructor. Inside the constructor, this is equal to the rect object over here. ये जो rect object है and this variable over here are the same thing both inside the constructor and even inside any method. In this method, as you can see, I am doing this dot width into this dot height. This variable is equal to the rect variable over here. So if I do rect dot width into rect dot height, it is the same as me doing rect dot area, because inside the area function, this dot width gets multiplied by this dot height. Let's quickly see this in action. Then let's do a poll if we understand classes. In the next slide, we will understand inheritance, which is a common property in classes, both in Java and in JavaScript. Let's try to see if this works. It gives me 8 over here. Can you take a minute and try to code this yourself? Feel free to copy paste also. You don't have to code this yourself. It'll probably take you more than a minute to code it if you're coding this for the first time. But can you try to run this either locally or on Replit? Locally, I'm not covering. We covered it a little bit yesterday. You will need Node.js installed. If you have Node.js installed, you already know how to run this. If you don't have it installed, then don't worry about this just yet. Simply go to Replit, repl.it, create a fresh REPL, click on Node.js, create REPL, and just run the code online for today. Paste the code and try to run it. Hopefully you see a similar output, 8 over here. Try to code this in the next 30 seconds. Feel free to copy paste as well. Maybe give a third argument here called color, or whatever it can be, let's say red, and then try to log, or call paint as well. Rect.paint. What does rect.paint do? It doesn't return anything. It simply logs painting with color, this dot color on the screen. If I run this, I see painting with color red because I passed red as the third argument. This dot color got set to red over here. Let's do a quick poll and see how we're doing. %. Let me open Q&A. We will take a small 2-minute detour. But what is the difference between old syntax object versus new syntax object? They're just both called objects. They are significantly different. That object, the old syntax object, is a key value pair. All it does is let rect1 equal to width 20, height 40. All this does is give you access to these properties, rect1.width. It doesn't let you attach functions to rect1. I cannot, well, you sort of can do this, area, which is a function, but you can't fetch this width and this height over here. You can also do that if you want. Like if you really want to get fancy, you can make this object come very close to a class, but this doesn't have properties like inheritance. That also, if you want to get fancy, you can do. But you know, this the point of this was to be a key value pair. It was not to create a blueprint for something. Versus the point of this is that you are creating the blueprint of a real world object. Rectangle exists in the real world, right? This is sort of a rectangle over here. So you are trying to create a blueprint for it. You are defining all the properties that exists. Width, height, color is what represents. If this was a cuboid, then you would take the third dimension as well. And you are letting anyone create an object of it. Versus if you use the old syntax, there is no class name associated to it. You don't know if this is a rectangle. This is a simple key value pair, and its goal is to give you access to these properties. Its goal is not to attach functions to the objects of the class. This lets you attach functions to the objects of the class. That's the difference between a native and this thing. Why are we not using where or const for class variable? Because this is the syntax. You are not, okay, why don't we use where or const over here when we define a function? Because we are defining a function. We are not calling the function and getting its value. We are defining a class. We are not creating a variable of that class. When you create an object of the class, you use const. When you describe the class, simply use the class keyword, very similar to how you use the function keyword. This thing can be used anywhere. What do you mean by this thing can be used anywhere? How to call a destructor? JS doesn't have the concept of a destructor similar to C++. It does memory management itself. You can add, a destroy function over here. And then whenever you're done using rect, you can call rect.destroy. I don't think it has the concept of an automatic cleanup destructor similar to C++. How this works? This is simply you getting access to the current object. What was the problem I said over here? कि यार ऐसे तो यहाँ पे भी you can define the area function, but here you will have to remember कि अच्छा this is rect1, so rect1.width into rect1.height. So this gets more and more complex to do if you're doing it in a native object, or even just forget that I mentioned this. This is a bad example. What was the question again? This is just a keyword, a variable you get access to. If I log, this anywhere, console.log this, and let's run this now. What does this print? It prints the object. Yeah, this is the rectangle object with this width, this height, and undefined color because I did not pass it the third argument. Let me give it the third argument. Now it says, what is this? What did this log? It logged the object. So this variable, this variable that you see over here is the same as the rect variable over here. You are just getting access to it inside the function definition. I repeat, inside the area function definition, you are getting access to this variable so that you can use it and do whatever you want with it. In this case, we want to calculate the area. What is the $sign? Where do you see the $sign? Here. Oh, okay. Sorry about this. Console.log color is plus this dot color. Forget the $sign. Forget the fancy syntax of string concatenation I had used over here. Just use this for now. If you want to get even easier, do this. Color is, and then in the next line, feel free to type console.log this dot color. Alright, don't worry about that other syntax of string concatenation. Where there is no color in it will still work. If I don't pass anything, these three will just get instantiated to undefined. This will become undefined, this will become undefined, this will become undefined. Area will become undefined into undefined, which probably returns undefined as well. Let's see what happens. As you can see, it returns not a number, NaN, because I multiply undefined with undefined. So it's not like you will get a runtime error. It will still keep on working, but you have instantiated the wrong thing over here. This is why people say Java is better. Java would give you a compile time error. Java would not start to run your code if you did not give it the right arguments, versus JavaScript just lets you run it. If we were using TypeScript, this would have thrown a compilation error. Please explain that this keyword again. What does instance mean? What is new? Great question. Instance and new actually go hand in hand. What are you doing over here? You are creating a new object of the rectangle class. This is you defining the class. This is how you create an object. यही syntax है. This is the syntax to create an object. You have to prepend it with new. Okay, I want to create a new rectangle, and what you are creating here is an instance of the rectangle class. You are creating, you can call an instance of the rectangle class, or you are creating an object of the rectangle class. Both of these are technically right. So the new variable is something you need when you're defining the an object. And someone else again asked about the this variable. So let's say there was no this variable. How would you, if I pass, let's say 1, 2, red over here. I told you when you create a new object, the constructor gets called because you are constructing the object. That is what constructor means. If I don't use, how will I do a, rect dot width over here? Rect is defined niche, वैसे तो this might work, but you get the idea. Rect is defined over here. How will I say that rect dot width needs to be set to this width inside the constructor? You are constructing the object. You want rect dot width gets set to 1, and hence classes give you access to this variable. They say कि यार जब भी ये बन रहा होगा ना object, whenever this object is being created, you can attach properties to it like this. Okay, this dot width equal to whatever you got in the constructor. What did I pass in the constructor? 1. So this dot width equal to 1. I was able to attach 1 to the object, to this object, the rect object right here. This just gives you access to the current object inside the methods. I repeat, it gives you access to the current object. अब आपने एक class बनाई है. What if I create another class? I can totally write this. Rect2 equal to new rectangle with 10, 20 and black. Then when I create the second class, this variable is set to the rect2 variable. When I call rect.area, this is the rect variable. When I call const area 2 equal to rect2.area, when I call this thing right here, then the area function में this variable is set to this rect2 variable. So that is what this variable does. It gives you access to the current object inside the constructor, this method, this method, this method, whatever method you want. Let's see if there's any more relevant question. Why we use this is a good question. We will come to in the next class. Next slide. Where in this function are we passing the argument? How do they get the value of width and height? Great question. I am not calling rect.area with some arguments. I am saying कि ये जो object है ना, on the rect object, call the area function. The width and the height are already bound to that rect variable. That is what the constructor does. जब मैंने ये बनाया, when I created the rectangle class, the constructor was called. The width, the height and the color that I passed got attached to the rect variable. इस पे width और height attach हो गए. console.log rect.width. If I log this, then 1 would get printed. If I log height, then 2 would get printed. So when I call rect.area, I don't have to pass rect.width, rect.height over here. The area function already has access to this variable. Over here, this variable would be this rect variable, जहाँ पे width already exists, height already exists, which is why this dot width into this dot height is enough. The properties are attached to the class. What did the slides say? The slides said inside a class you define the properties and methods. What is a method? Area is the method, paint is the method. What are the properties? Width, height, and color are the properties. The properties are already attached to the variable. You don't have to repass them in this area function. Let's do another poll and then let's see if we can proceed or not. 95-ish we need right now. If you're not at 95 right now, by the time we need promises, we will not be able to reach, oh boy, it's there only. It hasn't moved much. All right, we will stay here for 5 more minutes. So return type for method is not compulsory in JavaScript. No, in TypeScript is, in JavaScript it isn't. Why didn't we define width, height, color variable in the rectangle class? What do you mean define? You mean like this? You can do that, especially if you reach, TypeScript eventually. If you come from the, Java background, someone asked, why don't they have a return type? They do if you use TypeScript. You can add number over here. You can write syntax like this. If you are using TypeScript, we are not using TypeScript yet, which is why, we don't have return types. We don't declare the types over here, similar to how you would do it in Java. If I do not use constructor, then how to declare variables inside a class? There is no point of a class that doesn't have a constructor. The whole point of a class, unless you're creating static methods, which ignore for now. The point of a class is, ye class hai, you will create objects from it. So there is a point to the constructor. There is no point of a class without a constructor. That means you can't create objects. If I delete the constructor over here and try to do this, and it still works surprisingly. I would have expected it to not work only. But I wasn't able to attach any properties to, this rectangle class. So if you don't have a constructor, you won't be able to construct the object. The initialization of the object won't happen. आप उसको कुछ width, height वगैरह दे ही नहीं पाओगे. You won't be able to give it any properties, and hence there's no point of creating a class without a constructor. Is constructor just a function? If not, what is the difference between a function and a constructor? It is sort of a function only. It is automatically called when you attach the new variable. Whenever you write new class name, this constructor is automatically called. Other than that, it is a function very similar to area and paint, but you don't have to explicitly call it. Whenever you use the new keyword, the constructor is automatically called. Why did we create destroy? Ignore. Someone asked a question. Uska response tha. No need to worry about destroy yet. Rect2 is an instance of the class of rectangle, which means when it is currently in running state. What does that mean? Explain new and instance again. I can see the questions of anonymous attendees. New means I want to instantiate. Okay, instantiate is another word. I want to create a new object of this class. What does this line of code do? I want to create a new object of this class. That is what new means. This rect variable is an instance or an object of this rectangle class. Don't we need to define these variables or mention access like public, private? As I said, you can do that. You can attach public, private. All of these will get caught during TypeScript compilation, but since JavaScript is what? It is loosely typed. Hence, you don't have to worry about them in JavaScript. If we have another function inside area, then this variable won't work, right? Because of hoisting. It can still work, depends on how you define the function. So if you do const, area2 equal to, return this dot width into this dot height. If you use an arrow function like this, and if I do console.log area2 of nothing, if I just do this, then it should work. Let's see. Fine. Console.log area2. Where did I call destroy? As you can see, area2 was able to access this variable. New and these are the two things that people are currently confused with. New and this. Don't we need to initialize the variable. What do you mean don't we need to initialize? That's exactly what we're doing here, right? Const a, just how I write const rect2 equal to 1, or let's say an object. Similarly, I'm initializing a variable over here. New and this are two things people are confused with. Makes sense. Let's recap everything we have learned in this specific slide. We have learned about this thing called classes, which you don't need. I repeat, you don't need classes. As I said, you can always create objects. Okay, const rect3 equal to width 20, height 10. You can always do this. You don't need the concept of classes. You can do a console.log area of rect, and you can define a function called area, which takes the rect as the input and returns rect.width into rect.height. So you can totally do this. As you can see, there is no concept of new this class object over here. This is an object, but different kind of object. You can do this, but classes give you, number one, a more cleaner way to write this. Here I am strictly defining a class. Rectangle is a class. These are the properties of the class. I am defining the blueprint of this class. Okay, every rectangle needs to have a width, height, and color. Whenever it is being constructed, whenever someone calls new rectangle, I repeat, whenever someone calls new rectangle, this constructor automatically gets called. You attach whatever the user has given you, in this case 1, 2, and red, to this variable over here. What is this variable over here? It is the same as the thing that you see on the left. This rect variable, you get access to it in this variable over here. You attach width, height, and color. ये तीनों जो तुम्हें यहाँ से मिले थे, whatever you got from here, you attached it to the rect object. You just did it using this keyword. What is this keyword? It gives you access to this variable inside the context of the class. तो यहाँ पे तुम्हें this variable से you were able to set these properties. In the area function, let's ignore all of this. You were able to get these properties. You were able to get this dot width into this dot height. You returned the area that you eventually logged over here. So the new variable lets you create a new instance. This variable gives you access to that instance inside the class, be it in this area function, be it in this paint function. All right, let's see how we are doing now. Last poll, I think either way we will proceed now, but I hope it is sort of clear. Let's see how are we doing. Okay, 95%, 94%, 93%. ठीक है, let's proceed either way. I am here for doubts. TAs are here for doubts later on. All right, let's go to the next important property of classes. There are many properties of classes. Some of these we are discussing. Some of these we'll discuss later when we reach TypeScript. Class declaration, hopefully we understand. Constructor, hopefully we understand. Methods, we understand. Inheritance is the next property we are going to understand. We don't need inheritance for this class. We can totally ignore this slide as well. Now that I think of it, let's ignore this slide. This will just give you a reason to use classes over normal objects. I repeat, inheritance will give you a reason. That is one powerful thing that classes provide you. But we don't need it for what we are discussing today, which is promises, which is why this slide I'm ignoring for now. I'll cover it in an offline video. We in fact have a cohort 2 offline video that does classes. So you can look at that video and you can learn about inheritance there. Ignore the third slide for this class. Here, I had defined my own class, but JavaScript gives you some classes of its own. यहाँ तो हमने खुद लिखी, we wrote our custom class. There are some that JavaScript has already written for us. One of these is the date class. This is an important class if you ever want to do time related stuff in JavaScript. If I ever ask you to print the current time, if I ever ask you, start a counter that prints from 1, 2, 3, start a stopwatch, then this date class becomes super important. Notice the syntax, very similar to the syntax we saw earlier. Const a variable called now equal to new date with a capital D. If I'm using the new variable, what am I doing? I'm initializing the instance of this date class. What does this date class do? It gives you access to things like the current time, the current month, the current year, the current ISO string, the current time zone, things like these. So if you ever want to do time related stuff, you use the date class. Let's see this in action. In fact, let's do a small assignment very soon. Const now equal to new date console.log now. Now I can name this anything. I can name this date. I can name this current date, whatever I want. Let's see what this does. Let's run node index.js. It prints the current time in some weird format, 15, 13, 25. That is not the current time. The current time in India though is 8:43. But this is in UTC 0 time. India is in UTC 5:30. The date looks right, 2024-08-11. So it gives you access to somehow the date variable. Of course, since it is a class, it will give you access to a bunch of methods as well. As you can see, it gives you access to getDay. If I call the getDay function, what does it print? It prints 0. GetDay. Get the days of the week. Acha, makes sense. Today is the 0th day of the week, Sunday, which is why it says 0. Get month 7. January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. August is ideally 8, but since we do 0 based indexing, Jan is 0, Feb is 1, so on and so forth. So what is 7? 7 is August. Get year. It prints 2024. So now, have I defined my own class? No. I have used a class that someone else wrote. In fact, if I hover over this and if I hover over this and see it defines an interface. We will come to what interfaces are when we reach TypeScript, but you can always extend interfaces to create classes. Let's not go there. Think of this date. This is in fact a class only. Only when you hover over this and try to reach it, you reach, someplace else. Don't worry about what are interfaces right now. Do we understand how can we use other classes? This is one class. And here is another class called map, which is very similar to objects or maps in C++. If you remember maps in C++, they let you, set and get values. If you remember objects, normal objects like we had discussed, like user equal to name Harkirat, age 21. This is one way to do key value pairs. How would I access my name over here? I would access it by doing user.name. This is how I would create an object. This is how I would access a property of the object. This is how I would update the property of an object. That's how you do it for raw objects. You can use the map class. I repeat, JavaScript also gives you this map class, which you can use to again create key value pairs. You can set a key and a value. Okay, the name is Alice, the age is 30, and you can get the key value pair also. This is slightly cleaner to write, right? Rather than doing, map of name equal to Harkirat, I am doing map.set name Harkirat. And rather than getting it like this, console.log map of name, I am getting it like this, map.get of name. The goal is not to understand maps or date class. The goal is to understand there are some classes that JavaScript provides you out of the box. Can we do a poll? Feel free to write this code as well. Let me run this. Meanwhile, feel free to do a poll as well, Akash. %, decent, 91%. If I run node, what the hell is happening here? The hell. There you go. It prints Harkirat on the screen. If this syntax feels slightly hard for you to digest, you can do something like this, map.get name and then console.log name. Let's call it first name. If I log this, again it prints Harkirat on the screen. try to digest this code a little bit. Try to write this code for the next 3 minutes. Let me also look at Q&A for the next 3-4 minutes before we proceed to the hard bit for today. Wow, after class things, it makes a lot of sense why we use dot and something after that. Makes sense. Please explain. Okay, so new and this is something people are still confused with. You don't have to worry about using classes just yet. I repeat, don't worry about declaring your classes just yet. Can you understand how to use them though? Given there is a class that exists, this is how you use them. This is how you create a new instance of them. Declaring an object like this is more memory efficient since there is no overhead when it comes to defining the map class. Maybe, I don't think there's too much overhead here, in declaring a new map class, which probably under the hood also uses objects only. So I think either is fine. I don't think it's very noticeable memory head, but sure. If you define a raw variable, that may not give you any performance benefits, if I'm being honest. Why can't we use the variable in? It's just depreciated. If I remember, press Command J twice, it says the declaration was marked as depreciated over here. If I hover over this, what does it say? Declare const name void at depreciated. What is this lib.dom.d.ts, Harkirat? Inside. Okay, let me explain this a little bit, but don't worry about it too much. Basically, the reason it is happening, the reason you see a slash over here, is because there is a at depreciated comment over here. Okay, even though name sort of exists already in the DOM as a variable, it is depreciated to be used. The reason it is cut is because it thinks this name is that name and not this variable. But don't worry about why this is depreciated or why this is not used. You see a dash, what does it tell you? It says name is depreciated. Just change the variable name to first name and you're good to go. What is the use of map? What is the use of an object? Why do you define an object? Let user equal to name Harkirat age 21. It is to structure key value pairs together, right? So that you don't have to define them separately. Okay? Let user1 name equal to Harkirat. Let user1 age equal to 21. It is to structure things together. Similarly, map is exactly the same as this object. It lets you structure both my name and age in the same variable. That is the use of a map. For people who are asking about classes, again, happy to discuss class declaration at the end of the class. We also have an offline video, as I said. Worry about using classes for now. Don't worry about declaring classes. Forget how to declare a class, how to use a class. But this much you should understand. If someone else has created a class, how can you create a new variable of that class? If you understand this, you're good to go for today. Can I simply say instance means an individual object? You can say instance. A lot of people are confused with what is instance. Yes. An instance is equal to an object of a class. Both of them you can use interchangeably. Is a variable with a string a class as well? Surprisingly, it is. String is actually a class. That is why you can do something like where str equal to Harkirat and then str dot to lowercase. The reason you can call a function on this is because this also instantiates an instance of the string class. You just don't see it like this, a new string, something like this. But yes, even the str variable over here is actually an instance of the string class. All right. Cool. Let's proceed to the most difficult bit for today. I think so. Let's see. So the promise class. Let me recap everything we have done today. Number one, introduced how to create a class and use it. This was sort of hard. Some people were confused. It is fine. If you don't understand how to create a class, it is totally fine. You should understand how to use a class. Creation a class. There is an offline video which covers creation a class and inheritance again. I will post that video. So don't worry about this. But using a class is slightly easy also. Something you should know. The only thing you need to know about here is the new variable. And in the next slide, we used some JS provided classes. What were the two JS provided classes we used? We used the map class. We used the date class. What does the date class let you do? It is the simplest class in JavaScript. It gives you access to the current time. Const d equal to new date. As you can see, I'm initializing an instance of the date class. And then I can do a d.getYear. If I call the get full year function, if I do a node index.js, it returns me 2024. So I was able to use something that JavaScript provided me. I instantiated a new object of it. Now I confused you again. I created a new object of the date class. I called a function on the object. Okay? This is all that we have done until now. Introduce how to create a class and use it. Used some JavaScript provided class, specifically map and date. If you don't understand map, that is also fine. You should understand date, hopefully. At least one class you should understand. In the next slide, we are going to introduce the promise class. Another class that JavaScript provides you, which is very hard to understand, is the promise class. The date class, simple to understand. You create a new instance of this date class. You create a new object from it, call it D. You can simply call d.getFullYear or other functions on it, console.log d.getTime, console.log d.getDay, so on and so forth. It gives you a bunch of helper functions on the current date. That is what the object of this date class gives you. The promise class gives you a promise, as the name suggests. It gives you a promise. Okay, I will return you something in the future. I repeat, the promise class gives you a promise that I will return you something in the future. Does this ring some bells? Did we discuss something like this yesterday? A callback was called by someone else in the future. If you remember from yesterday, when we used set timeout, some function name and 3000. This function was called after 3 seconds. This function was called by someone else after 3 seconds. What is a promise? Promise class gives you a promise. Promise means vada. It promises you that I will return you something in the future. Similar to how set timeout calls fn in the future. If there is a function called fn, it will be called in the future. The promise class provides you something very similar. Let's first revise set timeout from yesterday. How did we use set timeout? I defined a function after, let's say log name, console.log Harkirat. Set timeout log name 3000. What would this do? This would call the log name function after 3000. If I run node index.js, 1, 2, 3, Harkirat got logged. So what does the set timeout function do? It promises to call this after 3 seconds. If you have passed 3 as the second argument, it promises that I will return you. I will call this function after 3 seconds. Promises are just a easier way to write something similar. You can always do what we are doing here. You can always use the callback based approach, or you can use the promise based approach. They are both used interchangeably. You can continue your JavaScript journey till eternity by just using callbacks. As I said, until my second year, I did not even know what callbacks were and what promises were. I would use callbacks everywhere. But then I did an internship where promises were used, where I had to ask my maintainer, bhai, please teach me about promises, and he taught me. Okay? So you can always do async operations using callbacks. Promises are just a cleaner way to do them. Let's understand how. Let's go to the 5th slide now. The promise class. Calling a promise is easy. Defining your own promise is where things get hard. Just how, right? Using a date class was easy. Const d equal to new date. Where you got stuck was how can you declare your own date class? How can you, what is this constructor? How do you define a get time function here? So on and so forth. This was a little bit harder, hopefully for some of you. This hopefully was easy. Given there is a class, you just instantiate it using new, and then you can call functions on it. D dot get time. Similarly, defining a promise is hard. Using a promise is easy. So initially, we will just focus on using a promise. Eventually, in the last slide, we will understand how can you create your own promise, okay? So throughout the slides, there is a function, specifically this function right here. Don't worry about what it does, okay? Don't worry about what this function is doing. How is it initializing a new promise class? What is this arrow function syntax over here? Isko black box lo abhi ke liye. Basically, assume this returns you something. Don't worry about what this line of code does. But keep that in mind for slide 5 to 9 and 8, and then in slide 8 we will understand what this line of code does. Until then, take this as a black box. Okay? A promise in JavaScript is an object that represents eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. This statement is sort of important and teaches you what a promise does. What does set timeout do? If I write, a main function that needs to be called after 3 seconds. A promise in JavaScript is an object that represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. Is this something similar? Is this the eventual completion of a clock? Is this representing that जब 3 सेकंड हो जाएंगे, after 3 seconds have passed, eventually after 3 seconds, call this function. I am not passing in any data inside it. This guy says of an asynchronous operation and its returning value. We are not returning any value here, but at least are we representing the eventual completion of an asynchronous operation? Sort of. Set timeout 3000 is an asynchronous operation. The operation says wait for 3 seconds. Calling the main function is representing the eventual completion of this asynchronous operation. This is one way of doing it. What is the other way? I said it is promises. Let's see how you do the same thing in promises. Promises are used to handle asynchronous operations more efficiently than traditional callback functions. They do something very similar. You can use them interchangeably. Whatever code you see in promises, you can convert it to callbacks. But they provide a cleaner and more manageable way to deal with code that executes asynchronously, such as file IO operations and timers that we have been using until now. Okay? Just a cleaner way to do what callbacks already do. What are callbacks? If you remember from yesterday, this main function is a call back. Okay, bhai, set timeout. Whenever 3000 have passed, 3 seconds have passed, call back the main function. Call back the main function. That is why this is called the callback based approach. What are we learning about? We are learning about the promise based approach. Now, let's try to first look at some syntax. Syntax on the left, syntax on the right. This is how we have called set timeout until now. Hopefully you are comfortable with this syntax. This is how I am telling you, you can call a promise. You can, this and this do similar things. Here, callback is passed as the first argument. Here, you first call the function. You first call the function that returns a promise. On that you call dot then and you pass in the callback. This and this are how syntax changes between callback based approach and a promise based approach. When you are using, a promise, you are not defining the promise right now. As I said, I have defined this function, but you don't have to worry about this. Assume this already exists. Set timeout promisified. Assume it already exists. Don't worry about the syntax of this. Worry about how to use this. The way to use this is set timeout promisified, pass in the amount, the duration you want it to be, wait, you want it to wait, dot then callback. Okay, after this promise is done, dot then means when this promise is done, call this callback function. So let's copy this over. Let's compare this to the set timeout syntax. Again, this part, assume it is a global function. Just like you have assumed abhi tak ke set timeout is a global function. Assume set timeout promisified is also a global function. So don't worry about the syntax inside. If you look at it though, it returns you the instance of a promise class. It does something very complicated here, which we don't have to worry about. But can you see it does something like this? Let p equal to a new instance of a promise class, and then it returns p. It is returning the instance of a promise class. It is returning an object, returns an object of the promise class. But it's just a little hard to understand how promise is defined, which is why we are taking this as a black box. Okay, could it have done this new date? Yes. So hopefully you understand just how I can instantiate the class of a date class and return it. I am just instantiating the instance of a promise class and returning it. Have I written this promise class? No, JavaScript smart people have written it. I am just using the promise class. Set timeout promisified. What does it return? Is it returning you a number? Is it returning you a string? Is it returning you an object of the date class? No, right? What is it returning you? It is returning you an object of the promise class. Do we understand this much? Let's do a poll here. Okay, the set timeout promisified is not returning you a number, a string, a callback, nothing. It is returning you the object of a promise class. I have instantiated a promise class here. I am returning that promise class का variable over here. इतना भी नहीं समझ आया आपने को अभी तक, ठीक है, कोई इशू नहीं है. Let's look at Q&A and try to understand where are we stuck. We look at Q&A. Why use functions instead of classes? I don't know how that is related to this. Why we need promise if callback works? Because of something called callback hell. It's just a cleaner syntax to write. And people justify it by saying that callbacks have callback hells, which is why you need promises. You don't need it, but why do you need TypeScript if you have JavaScript? Why do you need Rust if you have TypeScript? These are just better ways to write the existing thing. And for people who are asking for technical advantages, we will come to it when we reach callback hell and how promises fix callback hell and what callback hell is. Can you explain the let p statement? Acha. Do you understand this? Let d equal to new date, return d. I am initializing a variable, an object of the date class. I am returning it. Now, don't worry about what is happening inside this. यहाँ से यहाँ तक क्या हो रहा है? I'm repeating. Don't worry about this just yet. Think of it like this. Let p equal to new promise, return p. Don't worry about what I have passed inside over here. Take this as a black box for now. Okay? Just think of it like this. We will come to eventually what this is. Anonymous attendee, you can attend for account for errors in promises as well. We'll be coming to that very soon. Explain the inside part now. We will. What is resolve? We will understand. Don't worry about it. Ek bari ko for 5 minutes just try to use this rather than worrying about what this is. Why do we need a promise? Can you explain the code again? Alrighty. Promises again. Recap. Would it be fair to say promises are just syntactically superior way of writing callbacks? Yes, this is actually a great way to put it. Promises are, let me just pose an Excel draw. Someone mentioned would it be fair to say that promises are just syntactically superior way to write callbacks? Yes. It syntactically superior का मतलब क्या है हरकीरत? It means दिखने में अच्छे लगते हैं. They look prettier when you write them. They are just syntactically उनका syntax ज़्यादा cleaner है compared to traditional callbacks. Can you give a tree structure which is calling first? What does that mean? What is MS? It stands for milliseconds in this context. It is the number of milliseconds that you want to wait. That is why it is called MS. But again, as I said, don't worry about this just yet. Set timeout promisified and callback. फिर से बताओ. Okay. Let's try to understand promises one more time. How do you do set timeout in callbacks? पहले मुझे ये बताओ, do you understand this function? Callback console.log some time has passed. Set timeout callback, 3000. Can we do a poll? Do we understand this syntax? Yes or no? पहले ये बताओ. Do we understand, like someone said, the syntactically bad way to write asynchronous functions? We understand this. At least 96% understands this. Now, when I define this, were we worried about कि ये कैसे हो रहा है? How is set timeout calling callback after 3 seconds? We did not care. We understood the syntax. हम घोट के पी गए कि अच्छा, this is how you call a function after 3 seconds. Today, at least for the first few slides, we want to do something similar. We want to understand the syntax of promises, specifically how you call them, which is why the one thing I kept on saying was use this first function as a black box. Black box का मतलब क्या होता है कि don't worry about इसके अंदर क्या लिखा है. Forget this even exists. Assume this exists in some separate file. Given this exists, which again, forget it is in your view completely, can we understand this syntax a little bit? Okay, rather than calling set timeout 3000, callback, what am I doing? I am writing set timeout promisified, the other type of set timeout, 3000, dot then callback. It is, like someone said, syntactically cleaner. You might say, Harkirat, nahi, this is cleaner. Debatable. When we reach callback hell, we can decide which is more cleaner. But this is just a different way of calling set timeout. This is how we called set timeout before. This is how we are calling set timeout now. Let's run this. Let's see, does it do what it says it does? 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. After 3 seconds, this gets logged. Let me replace this with 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 seconds have passed, gets logged. So, assuming we don't worry about इसकी body, इसके अंदर क्या हो रहा है, let's forget that for now. Do we understand another way to call an asynchronous function? Another way to call an asynchronous function rather than using the callback based approach? This is the promise based approach. Why is this the promise based approach? Because we are using this dot then syntax compared to passing this as a callback variable. We are not passing this function as a variable. We are saying call the function dot then pass the callback function over here. I can also do this. If I want, I can also do this. This will seem very complicated, so don't worry about this syntax. But it's the same thing as what I had done before, which is okay, after this is done, dot then call this function. I can also define this function outside, after done. Set timeout promisified after 5 seconds, dot then after done. This function should be called after 5 seconds. Can we do a poll? Do we understand this syntax? Don't worry about this just yet, but do we understand this? ठीक है, we understand this. Now let's understand how does this work? What is this dot then syntax? Before that, let's do this. Let p equal to this. Let p equal to set timeout promisified. Console.log p. अगर तुम देखो, what am I doing here? I'm simply calling a function, right? A function can return me a number. Yesterday we wrote a function called sum, which returned me what? It took two numbers as input, a comma b. It returned me the sum of a comma b. So can I say this function returns a number? Yes, sir, Kirat. This function to returns a number. What does this function return? Let's see. We can just log it, right? Const p equal to this console.log p. It says promise pending. This function is not returning you a number. It is not returning you a string. It is not returning you an object of the date class. What is it returning you? It is returning you the object of the promise class. You can actually confirm it when I go here as well. If you now thoda try to look at its syntax, what is it returning you? Forget this. It is returning you new promise. It is returning you the instance of the promise class. What is this? We will get to. But do we understand a little bit this much? Let me also explain this one more time. Okay, forget this also exists. If I just do this much, function set timeout promisified returns new promise. It could return 2. Now it is returning a number. It could return a string. Kirat. Now it is returning a string. But when I write return new promise, what is it returning to me now? It is returning an instance of the promise class. If this feels complicated, I can also do this. Const p equal to new promise, return p. If this also feels complicated, const d equal to new date, return d. It is just returning a variable. Now the variable is not a string. It is not a number. It is an object of the promise class. Let's do a poll. Do we understand this? Okay, it is returning the instance of a promise class. Now how does dot then work, callback works, we'll get to. But do we understand this much? What is it returning? It is returning the instance of a promise class. Let's do a poll, Akash. Seems like polls are down. They're back up again. We understand this as well. Thoda, 92%, not bad. Now, let's understand how did this solve our problem. If you remember the assignment that I gave to the advanced people yesterday, what was the assignment? Try to create a promisified version of set timeout. fs.read file, fetch also, but don't worry about this. Set timeout fs.read file ka promisified version banao. That is the assignment that I gave yesterday. This is actually the solution to that assignment. If you look at it, I am creating a promisified version of set timeout. My name itself is set timeout promisified. So this is actually a solution for a problem that I described yesterday. Question is, how does it work? Let's see that. Let's make this syntax slightly more digestible. Actually, let this be. But let's make this syntax a little more digestible. Function. What is the easier way to function? Promise callback. Resolve. Let's try to go one step ahead. Now again, this will be a little difficult, but don't worry, we can spend all day on this. I've defined another function called promise callback. Okay? It takes a variable as input. Don't worry about what that variable is. You can call it R, you can call it resolve, you can call it my variable, doesn't matter. I'm going to call it resolve. We will get to why I'm calling it resolve. Let's forget everything else. What does this do? Function promise callback takes resolve as an input, calls set timeout on resolve. Can I say I've sort of created a wrapper on top of the set timeout class? If I call promise callback with a function console.log hi, and pass, I don't have to pass anything. What do you think this code does? Forget promises, forget everything else. This is slightly hard code that I've written over here. Take a minute and try to guess what this code does. If this code feels slightly overwhelming, function main console.log main is called. There you go. Can you guess what this function does? Take a minute, and then after 40 seconds I will open chat. Tell me what this does. It has no promise logic, nothing at all. It is just a wrapper on top of set timeout. Or, I can also call this after, wait for 3 seconds. This is actually a great name for this function. Wait for 3 seconds main. What does the function body do? Set timeout resolve 3000. Now this will be a little hard to understand still. Try to digest this code. Try to understand this code. After 40 seconds, tell me what does this code do. And I will also explain this, but try to run it yourself. Put some console logs in various places and try to see what it does. Let me open chat for the people who want to already have the answer. Main is called after 3 seconds. Bilkul sahi. Main is calls main after 3 seconds, calls main after 3 seconds. Created a wrapper around set timeouts with a fixed interval. Great. Just wait for 3 seconds, returns nothing. After 3 seconds, calls resolve. That is actually a good explanation. Okay, it calls this resolve function after 3 seconds. What am I passing in as the resolve function? I am passing main as the resolve function. So what will happen when I run this file of code, this file? First, this function will be defined. Then this function will be defined. Then wait for 3 seconds would be called with this function as the resolve argument. Then this function will go into a set timeout. It will go into a clock. After 3 seconds, this function will get called. Do we understand this? Let's do a poll. I don't think a lot of people would understand this. I would think this would be 80% or less. But let's see. No, we understand this. We don't understand this. If we don't understand this, iske baad will be very difficult. So I'm going to spend some time here. If you already understand this, let me give you an easy out for today. After this slide, we would have discussed callback hell, Google callback hell a bit. Look at these solutions and problems over here and alternate solutions over here. Okay, why is this callback hellish? Why does this syntax look very ugly? And then why does this syntax look slightly cleaner? Then go through the async await syntax, which is even easier to understand. And then understand how to define your own promise. That is all that, we're sort of supposed to do today. But it's just assignments, which are over here. So if you understand everything, quickly go through this and feel free to drop off from the class. Let me try to explain this one more time. Again, what we are learning here is teaching us a few slides ahead already. So we are already discussing how to create your own promise, which is something we were supposed to discuss here, defining your own async function. But we're already very close. So I'm trying to finish it. All right. Cool. Only 85% understand what is happening over here. Everyone understood this. If I call set timeout with main, ये तो सबको समझ आ रहा था, है ना? If I call set timeout with main, 95% said yes, I understand this, Harkirat. What extra am I doing here? I am defining a function called wait for 3 seconds, जिसके अंदर I am passing the main function. So what will happen? Main function will reach over here. Resolve would become what? The main function, which basically means I am simply calling this only, right? I am doing the same thing. I can do this set timeout of main. I can write these 3 lines of code. That is fine. Or I can do this. I can define a function called wait for 3 seconds, which I call with the main function, this callback right here, which eventually, yahan pe this gets called. Resolve becomes main and set timeout gets set with this main function for 3000 seconds, for 3 seconds. And that is how, the same thing happens. In fact, let me log resolve over here so it's easier to understand. I first log this resolve variable. Let me open the terminal. Let me run node index.js. What does resolve print? It prints function main, which means a resolve variable kya hai? It is this main function only, which means set timeout got called with main, and after 3 seconds, main function got called. So it is the same as me writing this. I could totally write this, or I could wrap it inside a function, which is something I did over here. Let's see if we understand this now. Can we do another poll? Do we understand this syntax? Yes or no? We understand it now. Great. 95% understands. So now let's come to the most complicated bit for today. This was supposed to come towards the end, but we're already there. So let's just digest this. The last thing was this. Set timeout modify, take the main function. This is the last thing to understand. Specifically, abhi tak set timeout promisified is returning an empty promise class. It is returning new promise with nothing passed inside. If you remember from the slides, what did I pass? In the slides, I had written something very complicated over here. Hai na? This is what people were asking, Harkirat, what is resolve? What are you doing over here? I removed it for now. I simply returned an empty promise class. And let me, just for now, remove 3000 from here. Put wait for 3 seconds over here. Okay? I've just added some code. We don't know how this runs, but let's see does it run or not. What did I do? This wait for 3 second functions, I put inside new promise. I passed it as the first argument. Just how I was doing new rectangle 3, 10, red. Just how I was initializing the rectangle class like this. I am initializing the promise class with this wait for 3 second functions. Why am I doing that is a different question. But do we understand? Just say I can pass in a number over here. I can pass in a string over here. I am passing a function over here. Okay? Let's see, does it do what it seems like it should have done? Does it call the main function after 3 seconds? Sorry about that. Command Z. Let's just see if it does that. Then we will understand the code. Let me run node index.js. 1, 2, 3. And it calls main is called. What gets printed? Main is called gets printed. Let me change this to 10 seconds. Let's wait for 10 seconds and see does it do what it's supposed to do. Does it wait for 10 seconds? Seems like it does. Almost 6, 7 seconds have passed now. 8, 9. And main is called gets called. So I was somehow able to promisify the set timeout call. The assignment from yesterday was promisify the set timeout call. I was able to do it. We don't understand how it is done, but I was able to do it. Somehow, the syntax from yesterday, set timeout, whatever function, which is main, 3000, I was able to convert to something like this. Set timeout promisified dot then. That is the difference between a callback based approach and a promise based approach, right? If you remember from the slides, what did I say? This is the promisified version. This is the callback function version. Callback mein pehla argument is the callback. Second argument is 3000. Here, the function is called with 3000 dot then you give the callback like this. So I was sort of able to promisify set timeout. Now this doesn't take 3000 as an input. We haven't figured that out. That is fine. But we sort of were able to convert our callback based approach into promise approach. Harkirat, why did we do it? Promises are better. Harkirat, why are promises better? We will get to. But I was able to make set timeout better. I was able to promisify it. Throughout your journey of development, you will hear this term a lot. Okay, let's promisify this. Yesterday, we did fs.read file. using the callback based approach, a.txt, utf8, and then the third function was, a callback, which took error comma data as an input. If this syntax feels weird, something like this we did yesterday, right? File read. This is also the callback based approach. What would the promisified based approach look like? It would look like something like this. So it looks very similar, but the promisified approach is better. Why is it better? We will come to. It is better. दिखने में तो you are doing nothing. You are calling it like this, or you are calling it like this. So when you are calling it, it's very similar. But what is happening under the hood is very complicated. ठीक है? Let's try to understand what is happening under the hood now. The most difficult bit for today. This promise class, just like a rectangle class, takes some input. A rectangle class took a number input. This takes a function as an input. And the promise class says कि यार जो function input दे रहे हो ना, the function that you're giving me as input, उसका जो first argument होगा resolve. Whenever the resolve argument is called, I will call the dot then function. I repeat, promise class says कि यार I will take one function as an input. I will take one function as an input, and इस function का जो पहला argument होगा, whatever is the first argument of that function, whenever that resolve argument is called, I will call whatever is passed in dot then. This is what the promise function class does. The promise class says कि यार पहला argument जो होगा, which in this case is wait for 3 seconds, उसका जो पहला argument होगा, I know this is complicated, a function whose first argument, this resolve argument, when that gets called, dot then का जो main, जो भी आपने यहाँ पास किया है, whatever you have passed over here gets called. So this calls this. नहीं समझ आया? Did not understand? That is fine. Don't worry about it. Let's look at it one more time. नहीं समझ आया होगा, ये तो नहीं समझ आया होगा. Sort of ugly way to explain this. Let rect equal to new rectangle. This is how we had defined the rectangle class 1, 2, red. What was the purpose of 1? It was, it is the width. What was the purpose of 2? It is the height. What was the purpose of this? It is the red color. Here, what is the purpose of the first argument? It says कि यार जो भी first argument होगा, उसका भी जो first argument होगा, whatever is the function that you pass to me, the first argument of that, whenever that is called, whatever you have passed to me in dot then, I will call that. So, since I say कि after 3 seconds, this gets called, main gets called after 3 seconds. Let's do a poll. I think this is a, you did not understand this. Most people did not. Let's do a poll to understand which side you lie on. I would assume 60-40, something like that. No, 50-50, even worse. That is fine. Let's do a slightly simpler way to do promises. Do this with me. Let p equal to new promise. Write this code with me. Console.log p. Okay? Let's write this code. Simple. Node index.js. Let's define an empty function. Function main. Function random. Pass that random function over here. Okay? Write this code for once. Take 30 seconds. Write this code. We will run it locally. We will see what this prints. We will go from there. Okay? As I said, very hard thing to understand. So don't worry if you don't understand it just yet. Hard cheese ki bhi the hardest thing we are understanding right now. How to create your own promise. That is very hard. So don't worry if you don't understand this. Try to write this code locally. Take 15 more seconds. Define an empty function called random. Say const p equal to new promise with this random function and console.log p. 10 more seconds. All right. What does it say when you run node index.js? It says a promise. This is the instance of a promise class which is pending right now. Let's replace this with new date. If I replace this with new date, what will it say? It is the instance of a date class. It prints something like this because of some reason, but this is the instance of a date class. If I write new map, what does it say? It is the instance of a map class. So if I write new promise and give it a random function as an input, it says it is the instance of a promise class which is currently pending. इतना अपने को समझ आता है. It says it is pending. A promise is supposed to return you something eventually. If you remember the definition of a promise, क्या थी? The definition was a promise in JavaScript is an object that represents the eventual completion of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. It represents the eventual completion. ये आपको बता रहा है कि यार currently तो I am pending. I will eventually give you something. I will eventually resolve to something. I will eventually give you something. That is why whenever you create the object of a promise, you should also do this. कि यार whenever this eventually succeeds, what does this say? It represents the eventual completion. Whenever you eventually complete, please call my callback function. Console.log promise succeeded. So this too is something you should always do when you are using a promise. Since a promise represents कि यार मैं eventually complete होऊंगा, a promise in JavaScript is an object that represents the eventual completion of something. You should always, whenever you get a promise object, you should always say p dot then callback. कि यार whenever you eventually complete, right? यहाँ control भेज देना. Please call this whenever you eventually complete. The question is, when does this new promise class eventually complete? You initialized the instance of a promise class. यहाँ पे क्या लिखा है कि the promise class represents its eventual completion. तो जब आप इसको बना रहे हो, when you are making this class, तभी तो आपको बताना पड़ेगा कि भाई you will eventually complete like this. मैं promise class बना रहा हूँ. I am initializing an object of the promise class. I have to tell it कि भाई you will eventually complete when this happens. Whoever is creating the instance of the promise class will also tell कि भाई you eventually complete when this happens. ठीक है? So there is one person who is creating the promise class. There is another person that is using the promise class. Using it is simple. Using the eventual value returned by the promise. That is as simple as doing this. कि promise जब हो गया, promise dot then call this callback function. That is using the call promise. But a promise needs to eventually return something that you have to describe in this argument. ये जो पहला function argument है ना, whoever is writing the promise, they have to describe over here when does the promise resolve. Promise खत्म कब होता है? When does it? It represents the eventual completion. When does the eventual completion happen? You have to define in this first argument. The promise class takes the first argument, this random function that I have called. And here you get access to this resolve variable, which also is a function. This is where, things are probably getting very overwhelming. कि promise took a function as an input. That function has the first argument called resolve, and resolve is also a function. So this is where I can totally understand why, function inside a function inside a function हो गया ये तो. Promise class, which takes a function as an input called random, whose first argument called resolve is also a function. So I totally get that this is hard. Let's try to understand this without going through an example. If we don't understand this going through an example, then let's try to create our own promise class to understand this a little bit better. पहले let's try to understand this from very simple first principles. कि promise class जो है जिसने बनाई है, whoever has created the promise class needs to tell ये eventually कब complete होगा. Needs to tell this has been completed. How will they tell? How will they signal to whoever is using the promise? This person is using the promise. This person is creating the promise. Whoever is creating the promise needs to tell this guy कि मेरा हो गया यार. I am eventually completed. Please log. Please call whatever was put over here. How will this guy signal it to this guy? It happens whenever this resolve function gets called. एक बारी को forget कि you put random over here whose first argument is resolve. एक बारी को just for once try to assume / understand कि whenever this resolve function gets called, it will call whatever dot then में pass हुआ था. Dot then में अगर callback pass हुआ था, this function will get called. The eventual completion of the promise will happen whenever this resolve function is called. If I call resolve like this immediately, तो भाई immediately callback call हो जाएगा. Let's see it in action. I have defined a promise and I have immediately resolved it. कि भाई तू ना एकदम से resolve हो जा. Don't wait for any asynchronous task. Immediately resolve. If I run this, you will see promise succeeded gets printed. If I comment this out, then you will see nothing gets printed. तो इतना तो थोड़ा थोड़ा समझ आ रहा है कि whenever this function gets called, which I am calling resolve, you can call it R, you can call it Raman, whatever you want. Hopefully इतना समझ आ रहा है कि whenever this gets called, जो भी dot then में pass हुआ था, that gets called. This function call somehow translates to this function call. How is it happening? We'll see. But if this is true, then what happens when I do this? Set timeout. Resolve 3 seconds. कि भाई जो resolve function है ना उसको 3 सेकंड बाद कॉल कर देना. Am I now signaling the eventual completion after 3 seconds? Am I now telling कि यार call back और resolve 3 सेकंड बाद रन होना. Please get called after 3 seconds. If I now run this, does callback get called after 3 seconds? Yes, it does. How is it happening, Harkirat? That is how this promise class is defined. In fact, one of the assignments in the last cohort was create your own promise class. I did not share it over here because it is very complicated. You can take it if you want. Try to create this class yourself. It's not too difficult to do. But it is fairly difficult. How is this resolve translating to this callback getting called? That is how promises work. That is the function of this promise class. Just how rect.area, if I do a const rect equal to new rectangle and call rect.area, this returns me the area. If I don't look at this function signature, I don't know how it does it. बस हो जाता है. It just does it. Similarly, whenever I am doing let p equal to new promise or even const p equal to new promise and calling p dot then with a function, just like I was calling rect dot area, I am calling p dot then with a function. When will this function get called? Whenever the promise resolves. When does the promise resolve? When does the promise eventually complete? When whatever you are passing as the first argument to the promise class, whenever you are initializing the promise object, whatever you pass as the first argument, uska jo first argument hai, whenever that gets called, whenever resolve gets called, this callback will get called. That is how the promise class works. Where is this written? In the definition of the promise class. If you try to write it yourself, then you will understand how does this resolve function translate to what's getting passed to the then function. Let's see if the number of people increased. Let's do a poll. It'll also give you an idea of where you lie, if you're able to understand it, not understand it. Sort of 85%. So if you do understand it, let me give you a problem to do. Create the promisified version of fs.read file, fs.write file, and fs.clean. Sorry, not fs.clean, just a clean file function. What is this clean file function? it is this thing right here. Write a function, not this. This. Try to write a promisified version of whatever is written over here. Write a function that reads the content of a file, trims the extra space left and right, and then writes it back to the file. It needs to be a promisified function, something like this. Await, okay, forget await, but clean file. You have to write a function called clean file dot then console.log file is clean. So for the 85%, try to target this. I'll be doing this next, but try to code this yourself. What is clean file supposed to do? It is supposed to read the contents of a.txt file, whatever is being passed over here. Trim the extra space. अगर शुरू में कुछ extra spaces हैं या end में कुछ extra space है, remove those extra spaces from the beginning and the end, and then write it back to the file. For the 80%, try to do this. For the 15%, let's start with some actionable questions, but I know they'll all revolve around कि यार ये syntax क्या है, what is this random and everything. So let me also see if I can give you something easier or to explain this a different way. But I'll open Q&A very soon. But just to understand, is there something specific I can help answer, or is it just what is resolve? Someone asked. Promise takes function as an input whose first argument is also a function which will be called after resolving the promise. Yes, exactly. So promise at the end is using callback approach, right? Not in this case, yes. In this case, हमने set timeout use कर दिया. So yes, we are in the end depending on a callback only. But at least for our end user, whoever is using our function, set timeout promisified, they won't see कि under the hood we are still using this. उनको तो ये दिखेगा कि wow, I have a promisified implementation of set timeout. Why do we use the new keyword? And where else the new keyword is used? Confused. Yes. Whenever there is a class, rectangle. Whenever there is a class, if you want to create an object of a class, you can't do this. Const rect equal to rectangle. Whenever you want to create an instance of a class, whenever you want to create an object of a class, you have to add new in front of it. Only then can you say कि अच्छा इसका एक object बन गया है. Only then can you call, let's say, an area function on it. Console.log rect.area. There are two things in a class. There is the class and there is the object of a class. This is how you describe the object of a class. This is how you define the class. So whenever you want to create an object of a class, let me create another one. Whenever you want to do these two is when you have to use the new keyword, because you are creating a new rectangle. You are creating a fresh rectangle. You are creating a new, right now I'm not accepting arguments here, but if I did width, height, then here I am creating a new rectangle with width, height, this. Here I am creating a new rectangle with width, height, this. So that is why you need a new variable. But I've completed the assignment yesterday. Can you please check bounty? Bounties are pretty random, so I do apologize if I missed your tweet. But you'll get another one, don't worry. Keep upping yourself. More than bounties, the real people are getting, referrals only. So, worry about that. And, that happens like this if you have an extremely clean project, if you have something that over impresses people in a job also, or, otherwise. So just keep building. It'll happen. Why do we use the new keyword? Answer that. Please explain calling resolve. The resolve method is library function, right? No, the resolve method is not the library function. Let's do it one more time. Let's go through the promise ke docs. Promise in JavaScript. Let's go to the official MDN docs. Let's see what does it say. The promise object represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. What is the resulting value? We'll get to very soon. To learn about the way promises work, you advise you using promises first. Why? If you want to learn how to learn about them, first understand how to use them. Then eventually, if you want, you can create them for your own. Let's see if there is a good implementation, good docs over here. What does it say? A promise is a proxy for a value not necessarily known when the promise is created. Abhi tak we haven't used a value in promises, but realistically, this is a very good statement. It says, okay, whenever you do a const p equal to await read file, let's say, then this promise variable, if this read file function returns a promise, let's say there's a function called read file that I write that also returns a promise variable. This p is a proxy to the actual value of the file. जो file की actual, let's say, you're trying to read a.txt, just like we read yesterday. There is a file name you take as an input. You'd have to eventually read the file here and return its value. What does p represent? P is a proxy to the final value. Kya final value aa rahi hai abhi? The final value is coming. Until then, do your thing, write a for loop that does some expensive operation. Do whatever you want. We have a p variable that is a proxy to the final value. Why is it a proxy? Because value abhi आई nahi hai. The file is still being read. So we say here p dot then, whenever the file is read, please call this callback function. And in the callback function, we say here yahan pe, please give me the contents of the file. So can we now see how a promise is a proxy to some eventual value? The eventual value in this case being the contents of this file. Whenever you write, I wrote await over there. Okay? Const p equal to read file a.txt. P dot then call this callback function. Whenever p resolves, whenever p returns me the actual value, usko log kar do yahan pe. So I hope using a promise is clear. Defining a promise is still hard to digest, but using a promise hopefully is clear. Let's see what else does it say. It allows you to associate handlers with an asynchronous action's eventual success value or failure reason. This lets asynchronous methods return values like synchronous methods. Instead of immediately returning the final value, the asynchronous method returns a promise to supply the value at some point in the future. The asynchronous method returns a promise to supply the value some point in the future. All of these are actually very good statements now that I'm reading it. If you've done promises before, to harden the concept of promises or agree with what is written over here. But might not be something you're able to understand right now. At least the last line, hopefully you're able to understand. Okay, the asynchronous method, here the asynchronous method being read file, returns a promise to supply the value at some point in the future. It returns a promise, kya ye le p variable. I promise to return you some value in the future. And then I say, theek hai, jab aa jayegi na, whenever you get that value, please call my callback function. P dot then callback. The question is again, how does creation of a promise work? Using of a promise hopefully is clear. Function is returning you a promise. You say ke bhaiya, whenever you resolve, please call this. That is hopefully clear. Question is, how do you create a promise? We discussed a little bit before. Let's try to solve this problem. Read the file. I said, okay, whenever you are creating a promise, the first argument is a function. And us function ka bhi first argument is something you can call anything. I am calling it resolve here. You can call it R. You can call it Harkirat. You can call it, final resolution value. You can call it bhejo yahan. Or send the final value here. You can call it this. Kyar, do your thing. Whenever you have the final value, call this thing. So that is the significance of this first argument. क्या जो भी तुम function यहाँ दे रहे हो ना, whatever function you are giving over here, the first argument of that function sort of becomes this whatever you pass to dot then. ये callback ही eventually यहाँ आ जाता है. This callback somehow reaches here, so that whenever you are done reading the file, fs dot, so if I do a const fs equal to require fs. If I do a fs.read file and give it the first argument, let's say a.txt for now. Let's say I don't have a very generic this thing, something like this, utf-8. And the third argument, if you remember, was a function with error and data. If I call callback of data over here, this callback gets called. Again, what was the other value that I wrote it? Send the final value here. So when you create the promise, the function that you pass in, uska jo first argument hai, that is somehow the same as whatever you did in the p.then callback. This callback function somehow reaches here, and then you can just do your thing, read the file that you're supposed to read. Whenever you're done reading it, call that function with the data. This function will get called with the contents of the file. This is how you write the promisified version of fs.read file. The promisified version of fs.read file is created by wrapping its actual functionality inside a promise. Wrapping its actual functionality, getting the ugly callback over here and converting it into a promise, sending it back via a promise. Most functions, when I say promisified it, or promisify this function, under the hood in the end there will be a callback that will be called. We just syntactically code it. We make it a little bit prettier by wrapping it inside a promise. Let's see, does it work? If I run node index.js, it prints hi there over here, which is exactly what is present in a.txt. So let's do a poll. How many of you are able to understand the promisified version of the read file function? Poll. Is not working. Let me create another poll. Did you understand? Yes and no. Let's see. I would hope it's running already. It's running. It's went down from 85% to 80%. All right. Let's look at Q&A now. Now the class is fairly ad hoc. 1.5 hours have gone through. I have sort of explained how to create a promise. I'm not going to teach anything more. Basically, whatever is present in the slides, defining your own async function, async await, I will cover in an offline video. I'm happy to cover, everything from here to here in an offline video. But let's try to, as many times as we can, understand how to create your own promise. Let's try to create a few more promisified functions, and go from there. Yeah. So, and if you understand everything, if you're in the 80% lot, feel free to drop off. If you already understand a little bit of testing, you can try to target some of these assignments, the week 2 assignments here. Specifically, this will be the thing that you should focus on. If you're in the 80%, solve some of these medium. If you want hard, this one we already did, promisify set timeout. So, this should be easy for you to do. They have tests in them, feel free to look at the docs to understand how to start the tests, but I'll be going through a video as well. So if you understand everything, here is an assignment for the next week. Please try to do it. And there is no way to submit the assignment. Like, you can create a pull request, but there's no point. It doesn't get merged. We can't merge 100 pull requests from other people. There are ways to run the tests locally. If you already understand Jest, then feel free to do it locally yourself. If not, I will create an offline video for this. Other than that, this is all that we had for today. The only thing we weren't able to cover was async await syntax, which actually is much easier to understand once you understand everything else. So let's currently what we are focusing on is this, defining our own async function. And this is a more complicated one. But before we get there, I'm going to now look at Q&A. If you understand everything, you'll just get bored after this, so feel free to drop off. All right, let's see. Why can't we have a top level await according to the docs? You cannot do that. Whenever you are writing await, it needs to be inside an async function. If you're writing await here, it is not inside an async function, and hence the compiler will complain. And there are one of two things you can do here. If you really want a top level await, you can create an async main function and call the main function like this and do all of your asynchronous operations here. Or there's another way to do it by creating a closure, something like this, and define all your top level awaits over here. Okay, one of two ways you can do that. Data flow after send to the final. Yes. So someone is asking here, data flow. Show me how does this data that you read from a file reached callback. So if you look at it, I mean, here now I'm going to go even deeper and sort of explain how the promise class might have been written. Again, that is a good assignment for this week. Create the promise class yourself. Define something like this. Class promise constructor takes a function as an input. This dot fn equal to fn, and then what do you think happens? It probably has a then function. Inside the then function, it gets some callback. This callback somehow, it calls this dot resolve equal to callback. Try to think how would this promise class might have been created. If you think about it, what is it doing? It is saying कि यार जब भी तुम मुझे बना रहे हो ना, whenever you are generating or creating the promise class, give me a function that is doing the actual asynchronous operation. I repeat, it says whenever you are defining a promise, whenever you are creating a promise class, just like we did new rectangle and gave it a number as an input, it is saying give me a function as an input that is doing the actual asynchronous task. In this case, the actual asynchronous task being reading a file. And when the file is read, when whatever asynchronous operation you were supposed to be doing is done, then just call the first function that I give you as an argument over here. When you do this new promise of a function, what is happening? In the promise class, in the constructor, some fn is being, set, something like this, right? Eventually, the promise will be, sort of calling this dot fn with, something like this dot fn of some resolve function. I mean, complicating this a little too much for you. Let's not go into the implementation of the promise class. The point is like very hard to explain. Let me think. What is a good way to explain, how does data flow from here to here? Okay, the goal for the next, 30 minutes is going to be just understand what you see on screen. Okay? Understand it end to end as well as possible. 80% understand this right now, 20% don't. So let's try to read from top to bottom and understand what is happening. You say const p equal to read file. This returns a promise to you. What was a promise? A proxy to the eventual completion of a value. Eventually एक value आएगी. This is the proxy to that value. This is a variable from which you can eventually lead to that value. How can you eventually lead to that value? You call p dot then with a callback function. Okay, जब भी हो जाए ना, whenever you are done, please call this callback function. Question is, how does this proxy resolve to the final value? And the answer it says कि यार मुझे ना ये function मैं तुम्हें दूंगा या ये function तुम मुझे दो. Give me a function जहाँ पे तुम पूरे अपने async operations करो. Go crazy. Do whatever asynchronous operations you want over here. And whenever you are done, which in this case is reading the file, just call the first argument to this function. Just call the very first argument to this function and pass whatever is data you got from that async operation. In this case, the async operation is supposed to read a file. Once the file is read, the data that you get, if you call the first argument over here, that data will automatically reach this callback. Whatever you passed in dot then. How is it happening? Lies in the implementation of the promise class. अभी मैं कह रहा था, if you really want to understand this, you should write the promise class yourself. Then you will understand how is data flowing from here to this callback. That is very hard to do, which is why don't worry too much about it. At least if you're a beginner, but that is the best way to learn how the data that you're passing here is reaching this callback. Let's say I ask you to write, okay, let's not complicate this. No, that'll just complicate this even further. First, how many of us understand this? Let's do another poll now. Were you able to understand this better? I have a better question next, which is, better. Why does it keep on going down? Because I guess the people who understand leave or something, probably. Now it's 66%. So let me look at Q&A and answer a few questions there. And then we will try another function. You will write few variations and hopefully one of them hits. Okay, Q&A. Resolve function call करने से dot then में call होगा, right? Then set timeout resolve में resolve argument हो गया ना? Resolve function call करने से dot then main call होगा, right? Then set timeout resolve 3000 में तो resolve argument होगा ना? If you want to see an implementation of set timeout promisified, then it will look something like this. Okay, the first argument here, which you can call anything, we want that argument gets called after 3 seconds. So whatever is your question here, in case of set timeout, what do we want? This promise should eventually resolve after 3 seconds. So what do we do? This function this is doing the asynchronous operation. Whenever the asynchronous operation is done, which in this case is 3 seconds have passed, then call resolve. That would automatically call this callback function. So and you will not receive any contents over here. So it will look something like this: console.log, timer is done. This is how the same thing would happen in the context of set timeout. It will be better by explaining by logging it. Let's do that. Let's try to put a few logs throughout. Let's use this simpler implementation. Again, there are a few things here, but let's put a few logs everywhere. Okay? Console.log, top of the file. Okay? One log over here. Then let's put a log here. Console.log, end of the file. That is actually a good suggestion. Now let's put a log here. Console.log, set timeout promisified called. Console.log, read the file called. And here also let me do something like this. Set timeout completed, or maybe callback based set timeout completed, and here finally timer is done is called. Let's look at all the logs and when all these logs happen. How can I check this out? Where are we? All right, let's run node index.js. Let's see what it logs over here. Pehle top of the file gets logged, which is this thing right here. Then set timeout promisified gets called, which is control reached here. Then const p equal to set timeout promisified. This gets logged. Sounds good. That is the second log over here. Then read the file gets called. Whenever you return new promise read the file, this function starts to execute कि अच्छा ये function कुछ asynchronous operation कर रहा है. All the meat of your asynchronous logic is happening here. What are you doing? You are promisifying a callback based function. So all of that logic is running over here. This gets logged. This timeout starts the timer, and then end of file gets logged. ठीक है? Timer is running. And end of file has been called now. Control has reached here. The thread is sort of free. After 3 seconds have passed, then सबसे पहले ये log होता है कि अच्छा timer has been passed, and then this resolve function is called. Whatever function we got as the input, we call over here, which calls the callback function, which is why you see timer is done. One more time with me. Top of the file is logged, this thing right here. Set timeout promise_if_id is called this thing line here, because this line of code calls this function, returns a promise, which takes this callback function as an input. Here we first log read file is called, then we call the set timeout function, which will start the timer. उसके बाद if you look at it, end of file is called. यहाँ आया timer start हो गया, ठीक है भाई. p dot then callback, हमने callback set कर दिया. End of file is called. Now after 3 seconds, पहले ये log होता है, resolve call होता है, that calls callback over here. So this is the flow of data. I can still totally understand if you are confused. How is calling resolve over here calling the callback over here, Harkirat? That is probably the biggest question. कि resolve तो यहाँ हमारा ही input है sort of. How does me calling resolve call this callback function over here? Is that the biggest doubt? Let's see. How do I know about writing promise class myself? How do I go about writing a promise class yourself? How does the constructor of the promise class look like if you look at it? Class promise constructor. It takes some function as an input, right? If you remember, new promise, read the file. It takes some function as the input. And we do this dot fn equal to fn. इतना समझ आया? Forget what it is supposed to do. Return new this dot promise, read the file. It takes a function as the input. I set this over here. What is the other function that gets called on an object? The dot then function. After the promise is created, we call dot then on it. मतलब जो promise class होगी, it will have some then function, which will take some final callback that needs to be called. Can I do something like this? This dot resolve equal to this callback function. Now, can I do this? Okay. This dot fn को call करो with a function. Whenever this function gets called, call this dot resolve. Actually, the promise class is this much only. I mean, there are a few extra things like catches and rejects, but उनको अगर छोड़ दो, if you really look at it, promise class is this much only. Let me, rather than using this promise class, use this promise2 class that Harkirat just wrote. This promise2 class, I'm saying, will do the same thing that this promise class does. पहले let's use it. Then let's try to understand how is it doing it. Let me comment everything. Let's see how this promise2 class works. Function, set timeout promise_if_id. Return new promise2. And a function which, what does the function look like? Something like this. What am I doing? Rather than using the promise class, I am using my own defined promise2 class. Because if it does the same thing, then we can understand कि अच्छा इसके अंदर हो क्या रहा है exactly. How exactly is the data transfer happening? Return new promise2 of this read the file function. And then let p equal to set timeout promise_if_id, p dot then callback function callback has been called. Let's see if I use this promise2 class that I've just defined rather than using the promise class, does it work? If it does, then all we have to do is understand what is happening over here. It might not work. I wrote this very quickly, but I think it might work. We will see. Let's do node index.js. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Callback based on set timeout completed. Callback has been called. So now I wrote my own promise2 class, which looks very similar to the promise class. तो अगर हमें ये समझ आ गई, if we understand this, then hopefully we'll be able to understand how promise class does it as well. What am I doing over here? I am saying कि जब भी promise का variable बनाओगे ना, whenever you create a new instance of me, give me a function. let's say this fn function, and I say, इतनी भी मेहनत करने की जरूरत नहीं है, you can simply do this. Okay, whatever function you have given me, now there is an arrow function here which will be a little complicated, but let me do this. After done, the constructor says कि यार आप मुझे एक फंक्शन दोगे ना, मैं वो फंक्शन कॉल कर दूंगा एकदम से. If you gave me the read the file function, I will call that function immediately, and I will give you an argument, this after done argument, which is the resolve variable over here. और जैसे ही आप उसको कॉल करोगे, whenever you call the after done argument in this function, I will call this dot resolve. When does this dot resolve get set? In this then variable. तो जब भी आप promise लोगे और उस पर dot then call करोगे, whenever you call dot then on the callback, this dot resolve gets set to callback, just how we were doing this dot width equal to 2, or this dot color equal to red. I am doing this dot resolve equal to callback. मैं एक वेरिएबल में स्टोर कर रहा हूं जो भी आपने मुझे कॉल बैक दिया है. वॉट एवर कॉल बैक यू गिव मी, दैट इवेंचुअली नीड्स टू get the value. I am storing it here. And whenever your asynchronous operation succeeds, whenever जो भी आपने मुझे asynchronous operation दिया यहाँ पे, read the file, whenever it calls this first argument that I am sending over here, यहाँ जाएगा ना वो, after done goes to this read the file function का very first argument. Whenever it gets called, this will get called, which will call this dot resolve, which was set over here, which means this callback gets called. So do we understand this old writing our own promise implementation? We might not. But let's see if this clears things a little bit. It might not also, it might confuse you totally. Do we understand promises a little bit better? In the end, it's such a small class only. It is such a small class, but it does, it makes your final asynchronous call a little bit cleaner compared to the callback based approach. कोई इशू नहीं है. 130 बच्चा अभी भी है जिसको समझ नहीं आया, 150 बच्चा, 150 people still don't understand it. Let's not worry about the promise to implementation, even though this is actually the best way to learn about promises, how they work under the hood. Feel free to take a screenshot of this and after the class try to just this much understand how does the promise class work under the hood. But let's not worry about writing the promise class. Let's simply worry about using it. Okay? Did we worry about how the FS module works under the hood? No, na. We just used it. We simply did a fs.read file wherever we had to. Similarly, let's just use the promise. Let's forget everything. Let's start from a clean slate. Let me look at if there is any specific question that people have. Nahi to I will explain the whole thing from the top. Top level await बंदा spam क्यों कर रहा है भाई? Await set timeout promisified 3000. Top level await does work in some new Node.js version. So if it is working for you, good for you. It's just some new Node.js versions that just wrap it, or I don't know how they do it, but yes, I've seen it work in the past as well. It might work on one machine, might not work on another one. Please, bhaiya, don't take this example. Take another simpler example. All right, let's take another simpler example. That is fine. If you don't call dot then this dot resolve will be well defined, right? Exactly. If you don't call the dot then the promise will eventually be lost. If I define a function set timeout promisified, return new promise, do async operation. What is the async operation in our case? हमें वो क्या चीज ऐसी करनी है set timeout को, what हमें वो क्या चीज करनी है जो हम promisify करना चाहते हैं. The real operation that we want to promisify, that needs to be done in this function. Right now that is set timeout. Okay, I want set timeout to happen for 3 seconds. After 3 seconds, I want the first argument here to get called. Syntax तो ये है. How is it working is a whole different ball game. But syntax looks something like this. Okay, when you create a new promise, you give it a function as the input. The first argument of that function, whenever that first argument gets called, then whoever created the promise, const p equal to set timeout promisified, p dot then callback, and the callback is console.log 3 seconds have passed. So this is the syntax to write it. What is it doing? सबसे पहले it is in this p variable putting this promise, a new object of the promise. In fact, I can also do this. I don't have to do all of this. I can simply do this also. Const p equal to new promise do async function. A promise is simply a proxy to an asynchronous function. कि यार ये जो asynchronous function हो रहा है ना, जब भी ये resolve करेगा, whenever this is done, then whatever you are passing in p dot then callback will get called. Whatever you are passing in p dot then will get called. Now someone said, what if you don't do this? Then the promise will resolve, but nothing will get called. So it really, if you don't do a p dot then, if you don't pass in, a callback function, then this promise will resolve. If you do a console.log p after 5 seconds, you will see its state has changed, but your callback will not be called. So if you don't do p dot then there's no point of creating the promise, right? आपने वो बनाया भी, आपने उसकी वैल्यू ही नहीं यूज करी. You created a promise, did not use its value. So that is why you should always use if you are initializing a promise, you should always do a p dot then callback. And if you look at this, what are we doing? Creating a new promise, which is promisifying an old callback based async function. What is set timeout? It is old callback based async function. It is an asynchronous function, but it is callback based, which means it uses this ugly syntax of पहले मुझे argument दो, then मुझे time दो. Versus we just saw कि a promise changes this syntax to something like, let me just show you something like this. This is the ugly operation, ugly way to write an async function. This is the cleaner way to write it. Now you might say कि वो clean है, ठीक है. The left version is what is traditionally considered cleaner or better. This is why we use promises. This is something we don't use. To convert this to this, what did we do? This is the code that we wrote. This is the ugly way to do it. Let me wrap this inside a promise. मैंने क्या किया? I created a new promise. I gave it a function. उसके अंदर मैंने सारे अपने पुरानी वाली चीजें करी. I did all my async operations here. And whenever that operation is done, I called the first argument over here. The very first argument जो इसके अंदर आता है, whenever that gets called, जो भी आपने p dot then में भेजा है ना, whatever you have passed over here, ये function call हो जाएगी. Whenever you call resolve, it is equivalent to you calling callback. That is why, after 3 seconds, callback gets called over here, because we say कि भाई set timeout resolve. ये जो resolve function आएगा ना तेरे पास, इसको 3 सेकंड बाद रन करना. Please run this resolve function after 3 seconds. And when you are defining a promise and taking this function as an input, ये जो resolve function होता है ना, it is the same as this callback function, which is why whatever you have passed in dot then, ये call हो जाता है. I think I'm explaining the same thing again and again, which is totally fine. I'm happy to do it again. But is there a easier way for me to explain this is what I'm thinking. Let's see if people have some questions. First argument of do async op has to be a function. Yes, it has to be a function. It cannot be a number or a string. Basically, whatever this is something you eventually, call. अब जब तुम set timeout में पहला function भेजते हो, it gets called eventually, right? If I do, something like resolve over here, it is something I'm calling. So yes, this will always be a function. Whenever you do new promise, do async op. Let me forget everything. Let me put a console.log here. This isn't something I am passing. ये मैं नहीं pass कर रहा हूँ. This is something this promise class calls. The promise class को तुमने सिर्फ function signature दिया. To the promise class, you just gave the function signature. The promise class eventually calls this with another function, जिसका पहला argument वो है, or that is it. Calls it with another function, which is what comes over here, which is why even if I do this and if I log resolve, if I do node index.js, you will see it says function anonymous. Resolve जो आया है वो एक function ही है भाई, and that function is defined in this promise class. So basically we have to create two functions. one for resolve and one for our main task, which we have to do. And the promise plays with these two functions overall if I talk in layman language. Yes, the promise plays with these two functions is a good way to put it. It takes things from this first function, puts them and calculates some asynchronous value and then passes that to the second function. And resolve का काम बस दूसरे function का रूप लेना है. That is correct. The resolve function is almost similar to कि इस callback ये बस यहाँ आ गया, ऐसा मान लो. Whatever you had passed in dot then, वो ही यहाँ आ जाता है. Which is why when you call this gets called. If I have set timeout with different times, what does that mean? If I have to set timeout with, if you have to create a real set timeout function, set timeout promisified, which takes some milliseconds as an input or some real time as an input. If I want to do something like this, set timeout promisified 3000 or 5000 dot then callback. If you want to do this, console.log time has passed. And if this feels overwhelming, then something like const p equal to this thing and then p dot then. If you want to do this, then what do you have to do? Return new promise, and जो function होगा, whatever the function is, you can define it like this. You can do this. This is almost exactly what I had done over in the slides. If you look at the slides, यहाँ पे I've done this only. I've used a different arrow function, but I've done the same thing over here. If this feels complicated, you can define the function inside this other function. You can define the do something function inside the first function where you have this set timeout, resolve time, and you can call do something over here. So if you want to create a real set timeout function, which reset timeout promisified function, which waits for 5 seconds if you pass 5000 over here, it waits for 10 seconds if you pass 10,000 over here, then you have to use this time value in your final resolution function. The easiest way to do that is not define this function separately, but define it over here rather than passing a function name over here. Okay, I want some async function call over here. I simply define the function यहाँ anonymously. What is anonymous functions we will get to, but basically this function का कोई नाम नहीं है, right? This function doesn't have a name. I simply paste a function कि यार ये function run करना है, which needs to call set timeout, which will resolve after not a hard coded value now, after these many milliseconds have passed. So this is how you create the real set timeout function. Please try to give another example without using set timeout. ठीक है. Forget set timeout. Let's simply do this. Const p equal to new promise. Which takes a function as an input, which reads from a file. ये भी हमने कर लिया. I'm thinking of common async operations. It is reading from a file. It is a timer. It is sending out a request, which will just complicate things a little bit more. सबसे सिंपल चीज क्या कर सकते हैं हम यहाँ? अच्छा ये करते हैं ये लोग. It does a very CPU heavy operation. ठीक है? It does some very CPU heavy operation and then does a C++ over here. Now I do a p dot then callback function callback console.log hi there. ठीक है, something like this I do. अब तो कुछ complicated नहीं कर रहा हूँ मैं यहाँ. I am defining a new promise. The function that I take as input should have a resolve function as the first argument. I am calling it over here. This is all that I am doing. If this feels complicated, इस function को बाहर ले जाओ. Function promise function and do it like this. अब तो मैं यहाँ कुछ set timeout वगैरह कुछ नहीं कर रहा हूँ. I'm not doing a set timeout over here. This is not an async operation at all. This is actually a full synchronous operation that I am doing. I am defining a new promise, passing this synchronous function as an input. इसका जो first argument है resolve, I am calling after some very heavy CPU operation. ठीक है? Then I am saying p dot then whenever p resolves, whenever this gets called, ये callback function call होना चाहिए. This should get called. Let's see if that works. Node index.js. It prints hi there. This gets printed. Let me comment resolve. Nothing gets printed. If I don't call this resolve function after I have done my async operation. Now this is not an async operation. यहाँ मैंने just to keep things simple, I have done a simple for loop. But if there was an async operation here, whenever resolve gets called, this callback will get called. If I call resolve with some string, let's say, hi there Harkirat, then I can also receive this string over here, str, and then console.log str. I see hi there Harkirat over here. So this resolve is sort of a teleport to this callback function. Whenever you define a promise, इसके अंदर आप जो भी फंक्शन दे रहे हो, उसका जो पहला आर्ग्यूमेंट है, जब भी वो कॉल होगा, जिस भी चीज़ के साथ वो कॉल होगा, वो सेम चीज़ के साथ ये कॉलबैक फंक्शन कॉल होगा जो p डॉट देन में आपने पास किया है. यहाँ आपने प्रॉमिस डिफाइन किया, यहाँ आपने प्रॉमिस को यूज़ किया. हियर यू डिफाइंड द प्रॉमिस, हियर यू आर यूजिंग द प्रॉमिस. Whatever you passed as the callback when you are using the promise, ये function will get called whenever this resolve function gets called, or whenever the developer of, in this case, promise function calls this. Let's see more Q&A. When will promise function start to execute? When the thread will free, it will call it sequentially. You put a log here, right? It will immediately call this. But usually inside this promise function, you have some async call, right? You have some set timeout over here. So, even though this gets called immediately, the async call will happen in its own time. In a nutshell, promise will pass the proxy to P by calling the function passed to the promise, and then function will do the real async work. And then when the result is received, you will have to call the first argument of do. That is correct. Good that you understand it. I understand it, seems like you understand it, but when you say it like this, it becomes so confusing. कि अच्छा क्या घूम रहा है ये? Real world usage क्या है? Good question. इसका real world usage है कि भाई everyone uses it. तो if you don't understand it, तो आपको नहीं समझ आएगा. What is the real world usage of TypeScript? Do you need it? It gives you something extra. It gives you some more type safety. But you need to learn it because every open source project, every big project, every good project uses it. Why does it use it? It has some benefits. TypeScript gives you type safety. Similarly, can you work without promises? Yes, you can. Set timeout, this function that we have used from time to time, doesn't use promises. This is a simple callback based function. Similarly, fs.read file, the thing that we did yesterday, const fs equal to require fs, and we did a fs.read file, a.txt, comma utf8, and then some function over here. Both of these don't use promises, but we just created a promisified versions of this because a lot of times they are cleaner, and a lot of times you will see someone else using a promise. Rarely will you define a promise. तो अगर तुम्हें promise use करना आ रहा है, you are fine as long as you understand कि यार rather than doing this, I have to do this. If you understand how to use a promise, 99% of your use case lie here. 1% of the time, you have to define your own function that returns a promise. You have to define your own function, promisified set timeout, which returns a promise, which is where things get complicated. But I'm going to say the same thing I said in cohort 1 now. Okay, if you understand how to use it, but don't understand how to create one, you will be fine for a really long time. Maybe 10 to 15 weeks तक you will be fine. As long as you understand कि अगर कोई function है जो तुम्हें return कर रहा है promise, how can you call dot then on it? If you understand this, you are good. If it is a promise based function, you do this. If it is a callback based function, you do this. That is the big thing you need to know for the next few weeks. And eventually we should come back to how to define your own promises. Can you show function where it does not resolve? Sure. So, function set timeout async return new promise function which does nothing. It does not resolve. Or, if you want it to be slightly easier to understand, do time call function, do time call, which takes resolve as an input, but I never resolve it. I simply do a console.log. Hi there. Now, if I do a const p equal to set timeout async and do a p dot then, this function will never get called. This callback will never get called because I never resolved from here. If I resolve from here, then this will get called. If I don't resolve from here, this will not get called. In promise2 class, which you have written, how does this dot resolve equal to callback work? Can you explain? Oh God, I totally lost that class. I will have to rewrite it. Let's see if I can reach it by pressing Command Z a few times. Is it necessary to be named resolved? No, you can name it whatever you want. Can I? Some other person had the same name. Yes, you can name it everything. Can you log C? Sorry, I moved ahead. Now it's clear to me. Okay. So now, will it make any difference if I write p dot then function? Like if I move it above? No, it doesn't make any function. You can write it, p dot then function, anonymous function, or you can write p dot then the name of the function. जब तक प्रॉमिस रिजॉल्व नहीं हुआ, जब तक कॉल बैक नहीं चलेगा. करेक्ट. जब तक प्रॉमिस रिजॉल्व नहीं हुआ, तब तक प्रॉमिस नहीं चलेगा. Why can't you find my doubt? I found it now, but I don't see the doubt now, Himanshu. Okay, there you go. कहाँ गया प्रॉमिस? आया था क्या? Is it necessary to be named resolved? No, it isn't. Imagine okay, someone gave some pizza example. Let's see. I've seen this in the past. Like the same example. All right. Imagine you are ordering a pizza. When you place the order, the pizza place gives you a receipt with the promise. Your pizza will be delivered soon. Okay? The order promise creation, just like you order a pizza in JavaScript, you can create a promise when you start the action that will complete in the future. For example, fetching the data from a server. जब तुम्हें पता है तुम्हें कुछ asynchronous करना है, when you want to do something that will take a long time, you give a receipt to someone. Whenever someone orders a pizza, you give them a receipt. Waiting. When you make the first order, you have to wait for it to be delivered. Similarly, the promise is in the pending state until the action is completed. I think this is complicating things a little bit, but chalo. Delivery. If the pizza is delivered successfully, read through it if you understand this. I feel this example is just, at least in my head, complicating things a little bit more. Ab bhaiya, let me look at chat. So, let's not look at Q&A. Not a lot of people now, so I can look at chat now. Alrighty. Any specific questions related to promises? There is I think an offline video from cohort 2 that covers this again. I could be wrong. If there is, I will post that video as well. All right. What is the difference between async and await and promises? Where do you use one and the other? Like, can we use promises when creating fetching call from? So async await is just, async await syntax is just another way to write promise ka syntax. Under the hood, it does use promises only. Usually it's much cleaner to look at. So for the people who don't know what async await is, there is a slide that we have here called async await syntax. Whenever you have promises, right? If this set timeout promiseified returns a promise, you can use this other syntax rather than you calling dot then. Rather than calling dot then, you can use something like this. Await this for 1 second, then console.log hi. Await this for 3 seconds, then console.log hello, so on and so forth. So this is just another way, another syntax to use promises. If someone has defined a promise, if this set timeout promiseified returns a promise, you can put await over here, which is, as you can see, it's almost like synchronous code. Aapko dot then, what then, you don't have to worry about dot thens. It's almost like you're writing synchronous code. Only thing is you put a await over here. So just another way to write the same thing. And this is much cleaner to look at always. So you should prefer using this. Promise class, let me write again and then get to your question. Someone posted this thing, simpler way. Okay, someone has posted a simpler way to understand promises. Let's see. Const passed to promise object, send cursor here, set timeout, send cursor here. was passed was other DD or in this thing. Visualize this. Imagine this. हाँ नहीं यार, तो मुझे भी नहीं समझ आ रहा. Why is learning promises so important? What are its applications? Well, why is learning JavaScript so important? What are JavaScript applications? It lets you write code, right? What is the significance of learning about let variable? Because you will use it again and again when you write code. Similarly, promises you will use again and again when you're writing eventually HTTP servers. So whenever you're connecting to a database, that will be a promise call. Whenever you are sending out requests to another server, that will be a promise call. So you need to understand at least how to use them. I'm repeating this. Okay, as long as you understand this line of code, you are actually mostly sorted. The significance of promises, okay, whatever libraries we are going to use in the future, they are going to return you promises. They are going to have functions like these, that will return you this promise. They're going to have functions like, this one right here. So they will return you a promise. So if you want to understand how that library is giving you data, you will have to understand how to use promises. You don't have to worry about writing promises for the most part. Every primitive data type requires instantiation, like int bool in case of a class. Consider a constructor you are assigning this thing. How does the object referencing to itself? Where was this created? Like in memory location or stuff? What is? Every primitive data type requires instantiation. In case of class inside a constructor, you directly, so when I assign inside the constructor, when I'm doing, this is an x comma y comma z, if I'm doing this dot x equal to x, I am instantiating a new, member variable here, which has as much space as x. Same for y, same for z. Like the memory location or stuff, what is it possible type? So it is being put in memory over here. Most probably it is being cloned in memory, by which I mean, if this was an x was a number 2 over here, that 2 got copied to somewhere in memory over here. And then, if you change this variable to 3, this will not change. Very similar to, if I write, what happens here, where a equal to 1 and then where b equal to a. How does this variable get copied over here in memory? Similarly, if you pass x, y, z 3 arguments here, and if I do this dot x equal to x, this was already in memory, you copy it over to this object. Hopefully that's clear. Let me know if not. So basically, promise function takes the value of the callback and then the time, and then adds the time and returns. Promise function takes the value of the callback. Promise function takes the value of the callback and then add the time and returns it. Just tell me this is true or not. It doesn't add the time always. In our case, promisified. In our case, what we did was, do async op. In our case, what we did was, we waited for 3 seconds and called resolve. So in this case, yes, it does wait for 3 seconds and calls whatever you had passed to this dot then function. But in another case, if you're doing an fs.read file here, then it will read the file, and whenever it has read the file, then it will call resolve. So it depends on when you are calling resolve over here. If you're calling resolve over here after 5 seconds, then yes, this callback will be called after 5 seconds. If you're doing some other asynchronous operation here, this will be called after that asynchronous operation happens. All right, we're at 10:40 here. Oh boy. Clear now. Tweet. Does the reject instead of resolve also call the callback function? No. Case of reject, which we'll get to eventually, whatever you pass inside the catch, which could be, error callback, that gets called. But, we have not discussed that, so let me not go there. Someone asked this. Let's see. Add calendar functionality, and then let's get this integrated to the main website. This is very good. If you can maintain the slides and everything, that's even better. All right, a few things. A promise expects a function that performs an actual asynchronous task. That is true. A promise expects a function that performs an actual asynchronous task. Once the asynchronous task is complete, call the argument of that function. Once the asynchronous task is complete, let's say set timeout. Call the first argument of that function. That is correct. The data then will then be passed to the function that you define in .then. That is a very clean explanation of what is happening. I don't know if it helps everyone, but let me just paste this in Excel draw, because that is actually a very clean explanation of what is happening here. Someone also said repeat the promise example, so let me repeat it. So the pizza example. The pizza example says, तुम pizza order करने गए. Imagine you went to order pizza. Pizza takes time to make. So the person gave you a receipt. That is your promise. कि ये ले तेरे को मिल जाएगा pizza after some time. Then you are in the waiting state. When you make your order, you will have to wait for it to be delivered, similar to the promise being in the pending state. अभी promise resolved नहीं हुआ है. You are waiting for it to be resolved. When the pizza is made, if the pizza is delivered successfully, the pizza place will fulfill its promise. In JavaScript, if the action completes successfully, the promise is what's called resolved, and you will get the result you wanted. Whenever 3 seconds pass, the promise is resolved, the pizza has been made. You will get the, control will reach here. You can do with whatever you want with your pizza. There is another thing around if the pizza is not made, which, ignore for now. We will get to that, what promise rejection is. But this is actually a pretty good explanation. A promise expects, feel free to read through it. I read through it once. Let me open chat one more time. One last time I'm going to open chat. All right. Online JavaScript editor free. What does that mean? Paste with some code. This is multiple callback which we are trying to handle using promises. So there is a limit. We can only use p.then for multiple functions. This is multiple callbacks which we are trying to handle using the promises. So is there a limit, or we can use p.then multiple? Okay, you're saying, can I call p.then multiple times? I think the answer is no. Let's try it, but I'm pretty sure you can't do that. Let's say const p equal to this thing. And let's do this. I think you can only, whatever is the last one will get called, but I could be wrong. Let's see. P.then callback. And then let's do a p.then callback to resolved 2. I don't think both of these will get called. I think only resolved 2 will get called. This will override the first callback. I could be wrong. So let's see. 3. No, both of them get called. So you can indeed register multiple callback handlers, or handlers for a promise. Creating a new object with a new keyword creates it on the stack or the heap memory. In case of the ones that we are creating, it should create them on the stack. It should create them on the stack. Could I be wrong? I could be wrong. 99%, no, it will create it on a stack. Especially if you're using numbers, it will create it on the stack. It is just a complex object, right? If I create a let a equal to 2 or 1, where does it get stored? It gets stored on a stack. Let user equal to, age 21. It is a more complex object, but it still, just requires X number of space. I would assume 99%. I could be wrong here. I mean, I'm bringing some logic from Rust where I've done memory management, but 99%. This will also get stored on the stack. When you create a class which just has a, simple attributes, then that should also get stored on the stack. But don't quote me on this. Google this. Can you get Etsing to make a video for the CMS repo? Sure. Let me ask him. Can you resolve without even defining? How to resolve even without defining it? What does that mean? It is asking premium subscription on Twitter to DM you. Let me open DMs. That makes sense. That is why yesterday when I said you should DM me, no one was able to flood me, because I will open DMs today. AK remind me. The way you explained promises was really great. Someone else might have gotten exhausted. What tells you I'm not exhausted? it is mandatory to pass resolve function as an argument. That is pass. I mean, you can get away, you cannot pass it, that is fine, but then the promise will never resolve. If there is a function sum, this is not the best example, but there is a function called sum a comma b which returns a comma a plus b. I can call sum without any arguments, but then there's no point of the function. Similarly, if I don't call this resolve argument, then there is no point of the promise, right? It never resolves. It is a promise that will never resolve. Then it is not a promise. Then it is a fad. If something is never resolving, and it is called a promise. So there is no point of you defining it if you're not resolving it eventually. Someone said another relatable example. Imagine you are hungry, craving pizza. Have both of you copied it from the same place? No, it seems like something else. You have two options: the old callback way or the modern promise way. Callback way, you walk into the pizza place, ask for pizza, cashier says, so sure, it takes 20 minutes, we'll call you when it is ready. You stand there stirring your coffee, waiting for that magical call. Meanwhile, you can't do anything else. You are stuck, okay? While pizza is finally done, they shout your name, you rush to get the counter. You visit the pizza big button that says order now, you click it and the website says we promise to deliver your pizza in 30 minutes. You happily close the website and go about doing your business. Maybe, either way you can do your own business. When the pizza arrives, the delivery option rings at your bell. No waiting at the counter. Sure, I don't know if they're technically right, both of these examples, but if they let you build intuition, sure. इसका मतलब प्रॉमिस के अंदर जो फंक्शन डालेंगे पहले वो एग्जीक्यूट होगा, फिर डॉट देन में डालेंगे तो वो एग्जीक्यूट होगा. हाँ, करेक्ट. इसको अपन अलग अलग फंक्शंस को अपनी पसंद की सीक्वेंस में डालने के लिए यूज कर रहे हैं. इसको अपन अलग अलग फंक्शंस को अपनी पसंद की सीक्वेंस में डालने के लिए यूज कर रहे हैं. हम इसको यूज इसलिए कर रहे हैं क्योंकि ये माना जाता है कि ये थोड़ा ज़्यादा सुंदर है दिखने में, और कुछ नहीं. द वे दिस प्रॉमिस इज रिटन, this promise based approach of calling set timeout is a little cleaner. Dot then, ऐसा माना जाता है, is a little cleaner than writing this, callback comma 3000. इसमें और इसमें कहा जाता है कि ये ज़्यादा साफ है दिखने में. What is the reason कि ज़्यादा साफ है नीचे वाला ऊपर से? This is cleaner, this is not clean. The reason it is said कि the thing below is cleaner is because it avoids something called callback hell. Now that's not technically true. You can have callback hell in promises as well. So async await is actually what makes it completely get rid of callback hell. But it is just considered more clean to be this, which is why it is considered to be a good idea to promisify all your async function calls. Why any code written after resolve in promise function does not run? It might run. It might not run also. Let's see. If it doesn't run, probably the reason is const p equal to new promise. Some function fn. Let's say this immediately resolves. And then I put a console.log after resolve over here. And then, p dot then. Console.log after promise. All right, let's see. It does run. After resolve also runs, prints. After promise also prints. So it does run. Thermodynamics back क्या? Thermostat और बाबरे. Like, can we connect MongoDB via Mongoose? It returns a promise, right? Correct. Exactly. That is another place where you will see Mongoose is a spore forming gram positive bacteria. ये क्या भेजा भाई? I will see this later. But yeah, I made Web3 notes. Let's see. I think someone sent me this. I don't know. If not, then this is the third person who's writing Web3 notes. Yeah, someone sent me this. Let's get this integrated on the website. It's pretty good. All right, we'll call it here, guys. 11 बज गए. There are assignments, and there's, I think, a video from cohort 2 that covers it. I could be wrong. That covers, promises in a more beginner friendly fashion. If that is the case, I will post that. I will post videos on map, filter, and reduce, a few other offline videos this week, and then the assignments and how to solve the assignments. That is it for web dev this week offline. Web 3 offline will be Bitcoin video, and then whatever was left from last week in hashing and encryption. All right, chalo, we'll call it here, guys. Thank you for joining. I will see you guys next week. Bye bye. Still some questions, but I think I'm exhausted right now. Twitter DM I will open. Bye bye.